I'd like to thank everybody for coming out today. I'd like to thank Peralta TV, Steve Zeltzer, everybody that helped organize the conference, certainly all the speakers. I'm not going to speak too long. I want to give my colleague Adam Bessie some time, but we've heard certainly a lot from macro to micro and back and forth in a lot of detail. So I'm very happy that this will be recorded and we'll be able to use this for future actions. Also, of course, thanks again to KPFA, to Jane Heaven, who's here doing the recording, and thanks to Andrew Phillips. I'm also the director of Project Censored. Those of you that don't know what Project Censored is, we're a 35, thanks. So some of you do know that's good. ProjectCensored.org. We do this book every year, sadly. It's about 500 pages this past year, and one of the things we've been focusing on increasingly is the framing and propaganda around education as it's connected to media literacy. So, what I wanted to say about education and its connection to media literacy is really, I think it's really simple and it's actually pretty easy to understand. And even though we heard a lot of complicated details of it, I think that the root of the problem here is that these are incredibly anti-democratic forces that are operating under extraordinary conflicts of interest. And these are things that can be broken down into very basic languages for us to discuss, depending upon how it's being framed and depending upon how people have access to that information. A democracy needs access to information. The public needs access to information. They need to know where that information is, and then they need to be able to actually disseminate it and act on it. Those are all things that have to be able to happen. It's very difficult to do that when you have a massive corporate top-down control of the information disseminating institutions, namely the news media, and increasingly, as we've heard today, education itself. That is an extraordinary problem that will destroy the fabric of any democratic culture, which is one of the main issues that the Occupy movement is really, I think, addressing. And the genius of it is that it doesn't subscribe to the top-down models about what are the demands and who are your leaders, because that draws it in to the old forms and old systems that allow the plutocracy to divide, conquer, and continue to control the direction of the society, and we cannot allow that to happen anymore. Alex Carey, some of you may remember, was a social psychologist, Australian, who actually wrote before he died in 1988. He wrote that the 20th century was characterized by three developments of great political importance: the growth of democracy, the growth of corporate power, and the growth of corporate propaganda as a means of protecting corporate power against democracy. Here we are. He was on to something. And this is why, again, to quote Greg Palast, the journalist at BBC, this is why we occupy. This is why we need to reclaim the narrative. And at Project Censored, this is something that we have increasingly been talking about, is reclaiming our public narrative. Media literacy, which is what we're all about, is simply another form of education. And I know we're here talking today about the educational system. Project Censored works more with media literacy and media disseminating outlets. But the two are, of course, very, very connected. They're very similar. The corporatization of media and the corporatization of education are about propagandizing the public and about wresting power away from public and more ensconcing it in this plutocracy. We also have focused more increasingly on what all of this is about, the overarching umbrella of our rights to education, our rights to information, our rights to natural resources, our right to public spaces, parks, our right to what we call the pursuit of happiness. These are all part of something that's called the commons. And we all have a right to the vast heritage of human knowledge and information that's been passed down over thousands of years. This is, of course, manifest presently in our right to an education. And if education is not free and equally accessible to all, then our democracy is, of course, a sham. Corporations do not belong in the educational sphere. They are not teachers. They are not students. And they are not people. So they should be disqualified from even entering into the educational sphere to have such conflicts of interest in the first place. That's how far in the hole we are. Sorry, that was depressing. But that's why we have to act. Getting here and talking is great. And I'm very honored to be here among the speakers. And I'm very happily going to introduce Adam Bessie here in a moment, who's done a lot of writing on education. And not on education reform. We call it education deform. Or as some of you have called it, reform, R-H-E-E. These talks, these discussions need to transform from being talked at to us talking to each other and going out in the community. We can be doing that again next Saturday at Berkeley City College at 10 a.m. where there's a planning session. We're going to be talking about that on our radio show next week, by the way. Peter Phillips and I have a program on KPFA. We're on the Morning Mix, the Project Censored show, Friday mornings at 8 o'clock with Steve Zeltzer of Workweek Radio. We're very pleased to thank Andrew and the people at KPFA for allowing us to be part of Free Speech Radio, to talk about things that sometimes aren't talked about a lot, even on Free Speech Radio. That's changing more and more, and we're really happy to be there and be part of it. We had Kathleen on just the other day. We've had Diane Ravitch on, and we want to have more of you on and the people in this room on, so please contact us to continue this kind of programming, to dialogue with each other. I had a brief poem that I wanted to read, I think also as a sort of a rallying point to remind us that the situation isn't technically new, although it feels maybe different to us at this time in our history. But going back to the 1760s, some of you may be familiar of a poem it was entitled "Stealing the Common from the Goose." And this poem goes back even further than that. However, this was a manifestation of it in the 1760s, and I think we stand to learn a lot from it, and I think it's something that we're talking about here now. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but leaves the greater villain loose who steals the common from the goose. The law demands that we atone when we take things we do not own, but leaves the lords and ladies fine who take things that are yours and mine. The poor and wretched don't escape if they conspire the law to break. This must be so, but they endure those that conspire to make the law. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, and geese will still a common lack until they go and steal it back. What we're getting at here is that we must erect our own narrative, a vernacular one, which is a counter-narrative to the top-down corporate pedagogy that is turning schools into nothing more than indoctrination centers to create a permanent underclass of wage slaves toiling on corporate plantations and maintenance of empire. That is what we need to do. We need to create this narrative and have our own frames. And Adam Bessie is going to talk about that in a moment. We need this narrative based on the very principles of liberty and equality for all people. And the right to an education, again, is one of those liberties. Our next speaker is a professor and colleague of mine at Diablo Valley College, teaches English, is Adam Bessie, writes at the daily Censored. I just want to introduce him in I think at least in an interesting way. We wrote about education and the framing of education in a chapter of the 2012 Censored book this year called Framing the Messengers. Play on shooting the messengers. You're aware of that. And Julian Assange of WikiLeaks is a certain recent manifestation of that. You saw the massive assault of the establishment and the plutocracy attacking Julian Assange for daring to believe that the public had a right to know what their governments were really doing. What they were really doing. And he has suffered massive attacks. In fact, Vice President Joe Biden went so far as to call him a high-tech terrorist. So that paves the way for these people to be criminal, not just demonized, but criminalized. Well, some of you may be familiar with Andrew Breitbart, the right-wing propagandist from Big Government blog. Breitbart has worked in concert with many right-wing provocateurs, and a while back, Breitbart wrote on his blog, quote, "We're going to take on teachers next. We're going to go after the teachers, the union organizers." And of course, they've done that in classrooms, and they continue to do that to teachers. And even though on the left, we don't like to use terms like there's a war on and we're waging wars, but however we like to talk about it is irrelevant technically, because there is a war on education and on teachers and on the public, and we need to fight back. And that's of course what all of us do on a daily basis and what we're doing here. Well, here's an example introducing Adam Bessie of how he was attacked personally by the American Enterprise Institute. We heard all about other foundations earlier. Here's another right-wing foundation. By the way, the liberals are involved in these foundations attacking as well. That's part of that false paradigm and that narrative we seem trapped in, where all these people that are demanding we must support Obama because we have no alternative. We are the alternative. Quote from Frederick Hess, "Educator and scholar Adam Bessie made clear just how devoid of thought are claims that schools should be protected from responsible belt-tightening." Well, what he was getting at was the fact that Bessie was writing about the conflicts of interest and how the corporate media writes about these people and routinely quotes these people that work at these foundations, and they're never called out for their biases, and it's never investigated as to who funds them or what their ends are. They're quoted as objective experts from the American Enterprise Institute. Hess went on to say that Adam Bessie is a vapid champion of the status quo.